today's movie review, I'll be reviewing the Return of Godzilla, the overall 16th installment of the Godzilla franchise, and this is a huge turning point for the Godzilla franchise in general because, as I mentioned in my previous Godzilla review, with the Terra Mechagodzilla underperforming at the box office, this canceled any future projects that Toho wanted to produce, which led to Godzilla's first hiatus. But during 1979, in the wake of the 3 Mile Island accident, and with Godzilla's, at the time, 30th anniversary coming up, the producers of Toho decided to bring the Godzilla franchise back to its roots of being dark and gritty and focusing on a lot more anti-nuclear themes. And from there on out, this led to several different drafts for this one movie. One of them being an American-produced movie, which I'll talk about later when I get to the 1998 American Godzilla movie, but anywho, one of the first drafts for this movie would have revolved around Godzilla battling this giant robot that was constructed by the self-defense force, but this idea went nowhere, which would have led to the second idea being a movie called Resurrection of Godzilla, and there's not one but two different variations of the same script, in which not only would it feature the return of Godzilla, but he also would have fought a new monster capable of shape-shifting called Bagan, depending on what environment it was in. For example, if the monster itself was in the water, it would have taken on more of an aquatic reptile-like form. If it was in the sky, it would have transformed into a dragon. If it was on land, it would have transformed into a giant monkey. And with the second draft, it was also very, very similar, with the one major difference being that in the final battle, this new monster would have had a final form which would have been a composite form of the other three forms put together. But due to the complicated transformation scenes for each of these new forms for this one monster, Toho decided to scrap this monster altogether, which led to the creation of this movie, which, much like the original 1954 Godzilla movie, it too would get an Americanized release, simply referred to as Godzilla 1985, with Raymond Burr reprising his role of American journalist Steve Martin from the 1956 Americanized cut Godzilla King of the Monsters, but would obviously refer to the character as Mr. Martin due to obvious reasons that the actor Steve Martin was popular around this time period. And I also put this movie in the same vein as Godzilla vs. Megalon in regards to its home video release, because growing up for the longest time, this is one of the few Godzilla movies I had a hard time trying to get a hold of, since, much like Godzilla vs. Megalon, the only way you could find this was either taping the movie off TV when they did show it, or buying a bootleg of it. It wasn't until, I think, 2015 or 2016 when Kraken did a release of the movie, but even then it wasn't the full package. It only came with the Japanese cut and the AIP English dub, since New World Pictures or Anchor Bay owns the rights to the Americanized version of the movie. Or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head, but anywho. So, in a sense, this movie was considered lost for a new generation of Godzilla fans, myself included. Since then, the movie has gone on to be considered not only one of the better installments of the Heisei period of the Godzilla franchise, but it's also considered to be one of the best installments of the franchise in general. Which leads me into my big question. Is the Return of Godzilla a good way to kick off the Heisei period of the Godzilla franchise? As for the plot of the movie, after a series of boating accidents and the sudden disappearance of a Russian submarine, the citizens of Japan, ranging from the Prime Minister, a scientist, and an investigator, discover that a brand new Godzilla has emerged, wreaking havoc on Japan. To make matters even worse, the Americans and Soviets are prepared for an all-out nuclear war, with the Japanese caught dead in the middle. Can the Japanese survive this series of unfortunate events, or will a combination of Godzilla and the Cold War lead to Japan's destruction? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, I love the way this movie's plot structure unfolds, for the simple reason that it's very similar to the 1956 giant monster movie Rodan, where each act in the movie is essentially a different type of movie. For example, with Rodan, the first act of the movie is a giant killer bug movie. The second act is a psychological horror with Lovecraftian elements. The last act of the movie is a giant monster movie. With this movie, on the other hand, the first act is a horror movie. The second act is a political drama, whereas the third act is a giant monster movie, which is very unique for a Godzilla movie, since most Godzilla movies before this had a very straightforward plot, depending on what the movie was, especially in comparison to the later Godzilla movies that came out during the 1970s that just consisted of straightforward alien invasion plots. So I do appreciate that this movie was trying something new with the way it was trying to present its narrative. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the way Godzilla is depicted in this movie. Since the filmmakers decided to depict Godzilla the way he was back when he first appeared in 1954, where it's not some campy superhero, but a flesh and blood creature that relies on natural instinct. And despite him being very powerful, he's not unstoppable, since the filmmakers did give this version of Godzilla a few weaknesses here and there. And I think the filmmakers did a good job of updating Godzilla appropriately for this movie to reflect the time period in which this movie came out. Because you have to remember, during the 1980s was basically the height of the Cold War, or the final stages of the Cold War, meaning that this interpretation of Godzilla is depicted as the beast of the literal apocalypse. Because remember, Japan, geographically speaking, is between the at the time USSR and the United States, and the Japanese feared the outcome of the Cold War would result in both the USSR and the Americans waging war in Japan itself, which is why Godzilla is presented as being the beast of the apocalypse and including a lot of politics from that time period during the second act of the movie, in which you have the Japanese Prime Minister talking to both representatives of the USSR and the United States. Another aspect of the movie that I liked has to do with the climax of the movie, in which for a good chunk of it we see Godzilla battling this new super weapon called the Super X, which is a nice change of pace from the usual tanks and jets that we usually see anytime Godzilla fights the Japanese military. And on top of that, this starts a new trend for this particular continuity of Godzilla movies, in which every movie after this, the Japanese military in some shape or form tries to create some super weapon in order to take down Godzilla. And on top of that, the Super X itself is kind of refreshing in regards to its design, where it's not too overly complicated, it's just simple. And on top of that, we never seen Godzilla fight a flying fortress before, so that I thought was pretty cool. Although I do have a few problems with it, which I'll talk about later, but as the Super X sits, it's a unique addition to the Godzilla franchise. Another aspect of the movie that I liked is the way the movie utilized color throughout the story, and I can think of 3 examples. The first example that comes to mind occurs near the beginning of the movie, where you have the main character entering the boat. And for the most part, the colors associated in the boat are very dark and dreary, but there are a few occasions where certain parts of the boat are lit up by the color purple. Now, the color purple in the United States usually represents one of few things. It can represent royalty, wisdom, creativity, nobility, mystery, so on and so forth. But the color purple in Japanese entertainment usually represents death. And seeing that our main character is on a boat filled with dead bodies, the purple lighting makes sense within the context of this scene in more ways than one. Other than the main character finding a bunch of dead bodies, he's also trying to figure out the mystery behind what killed the crew of this boat. For my second color-coded example, has to do with the color combination of red and green. Anytime the camera shows a city landscape and the buildings are lit up in a way where they almost give off this green color with some red lighting off to the sides of the buildings. Because I didn't think about Christmas. And the thing is, anytime you think about the color combination of red and green, you usually think of Christmas. A holiday that's usually known for being joyful, pleasant, sometimes chaotic, but usually associated with something positive. With the way the red and green combination is used during these landscaping shots, there's this almost eerie vibe to the buildings themselves. And I have a theory as to why this might be the case. When you look at mankind as a whole, we are the most invasive species on Earth, because no matter what terrain we enter, we always change the ecosystem for better or for worse, replacing the jungle with an urban jungle, something that's unnatural. And with Godzilla in this movie, on top of being the beast of the apocalypse because of the Cold War politics, he's also meant to represent nature itself. More specifically, the chaotic side of nature, destroying the urban jungle as a form of course correction. one. Now, whether or not the filmmakers had this idea when filming these select shots, I'm not sure, probably not, but that is a unique way of looking at the usage of the colors green and red for those particular scenes without thinking of Christmas, which is impressive, because the only other movie I can think of that uses the combination of red and green and not have it be a Christmas movie is the French movie Amélie. But getting off topic here. And for my third and final example of how this movie incorporates color into the narrative, predominantly occurs throughout the last third of the movie when Godzilla goes on his initial rampage. And the color in question is yellow. And much like purple, the color yellow can mean many things, such as optimism, happiness, hope, confidence, so on and so forth. And it's the way in which the color yellow is used. Because during the last third, we have one of two things going on. We have the human military doing their best to battle Godzilla, while our main cast of human characters predominantly focus on building a homing device that lures Godzilla from the city to a volcano. And the way the movie utilizes the color yellow is meant to represent hope, but with different shades of yellow in association with both the military and our main cast of human characters. For example, anytime we see the military in armored vehicles, there's always this flashing yellow light, but there's a dark tint to it. Now, when we focus on our main cast of human characters, the main female protagonist is seen wearing this bright yellow t-shirt. And I feel that between the military's dark tinted flashing lights and our female protagonist's bright yellow shirt, this to me felt intentional. Because think back to the boardroom meeting in which we see Professor Hayashida explain his plan of creating this homing device to lure Godzilla to a volcano. Most of the exec board members are more in favor of the Super X plan. Note what the Prime Minister does, because even though he does commence with the operation with Super X, he also sees potential in Professor Hayashida's homing device and allows him to create said homing device. And the reason I think this occurs, the Prime Minister sees both the Super X and this homing device as potential hope for mankind. With the military, perhaps that darker shade of yellow is meant to represent that even though this could represent the thing to stop Godzilla, this could potentially be the wrong choice. Whereas Professor Hayashida's homing device is associated with this bright yellow color, this represents the correct choice in defeating Godzilla. Another aspect of the movie that I liked is the soundtrack. Now, I don't quite remember who does the soundtrack to this movie, but I think of all the soundtracks in a Godzilla movie up to this point, this in my opinion is the most underrated. In that sense where you can clearly tell the person who made this soundtrack took a lot of influence from Akira Ifukube, but there's a different flavor to it. For example, if I had to compare the soundtrack to this movie with the soundtrack heard in the original 1954 Godzilla movie, there are some similarities where anytime the military show up, the music's a bit more bombastic, or anytime you have Godzilla going on a rampage, the music's more horrifying, and so on and so forth. But, like I mentioned a few seconds ago, there's a different flavor to it. And on top of that, I found the soundtrack overall in this movie to be very somber, which I think works for the more apocalyptic tone of the movie. Another aspect of the movie that I liked is the ending of the movie from a storytelling perspective. And if you're wondering what I mean by this, I mean the way in which the ending of the movie is told. Because during the end of the movie in which we see Godzilla plummet into the volcano, there is no line of dialogue spoken by any of the characters or any form of narration. You get exactly what's going on through a combination of the music that's playing in the background, the camera angles, and the humans' combination of facial expressions and body language. You understand exactly what's going on and what the characters are feeling at that exact moment without a single line of dialogue, which I think is super impressive and a very unique way to end a Godzilla movie. Now we enter the portion of the review in which I talk about aspects of the movie that I have mixed feelings towards. The big one being the actual special effects for the movie, since this Godzilla movie utilizes a lot of the same techniques that we saw in the previous few Godzilla movies. Everything from a man in suit to small scale miniatures, the occasional usage of a blue or green screen effect. The difference being, whereas some of the later Showa era Godzilla movies had a very small budget to work with. This movie, from the looks of it, had a gigantic budget. And while the special effects might be dated by today's standards, I think they look amazing and perform as intended for this movie. And I think of all the small-scale miniatures that I've seen up to this point within the Godzilla franchise, these have got to be the most detailed miniatures in the entire franchise. I mean, there's a point in time where you see the Ghostbusters logo on one of the streets. I think that was amazing. Now, where I think the special effects suffer, on the other hand, has to do with a combination of one of two things. Godzilla himself, along with some of the chroma key effects. Starting with the chroma key effects, for the simple reason that I have more of a nitpick than an actual problem with the chroma key effects, because the way it's used in this movie is very ambitious. From a few scenes where you have Godzilla waking up after his initial battle with the Super X, and you have a bunch of people at the bottom of the screen running away from him as he's waking up, to a scene in which involves a helicopter flying to a building in which our characters are being held at, and when we see a bird's eye view of this building, it's actually a small scale miniature, but in one of the windows we see what is clearly a green screen effect of said characters waving at the helicopter. And the thing is, I think the way the movie was trying to use some of these effects are very ambitious for the time period, and I get what they were doing. It's just one of those things where I just don't think the actual effect has aged very well, because when those effect shots do show up, they don't look very good. But you don't see them too often. Although I do find it kind of sad that the type of chroma key effects you see in the original 1954 Godzilla movie, in my opinion, held up a lot better than the chroma key effects that were used for this movie. And this movie came out 30 years later after the original movie. Then you have Godzilla himself. And here's the thing, he's depicted in one of two different ways. You still have the traditional man in suit technique, which is used throughout the movie, but then there are points in time where the filmmakers apparently built this 15-foot tall animatronic of Godzilla, and they used that for certain scenes too. And I'll say this much, in regards to the actual suit itself, everything from the neck down looks great. The face, on the other hand, is where I start having problems. And it really depends on how it's shot. Because if you know what the suit looks like, the suit looks as if Godzilla's giving some really derpy looks. And here's the thing, if the camera is looking at Godzilla from a side point of view, or maybe if the camera is positioned in a way where it's looking down at him and you don't see his eyes due to the shadows, it looks fine. But as soon as you get a clear shot of his eyes from the front, it looks so goofy, and it makes him less threatening. Now, as for the 15-foot animatronic, on the other hand, props to the special effects crew for creating that Godzilla prop, but it's not used very often. And it's also got the reverse problems that the Godzilla suit has, because anytime you actually do see the animatronic in action, you only ever see from the neck up, whether it's his entire head, and it looks great. Even when they shoot it from the front, he looks pretty menacing. But as soon as they show anything below the neck, and you start seeing his arms like wiggle, it doesn't look convincing whatsoever. It just makes Godzilla look more like a Chuck E. Cheese animatronic as opposed to a living, breathing creature. Another aspect of the movie that I have mixed feelings on is the overall reason as to why this movie exists in the first place. Because remember, like I stated at the beginning of this review, this movie was meant to capitalize on the, at the time, 30th anniversary of Godzilla, and the filmmakers wanted to bring Godzilla back to his darker, grittier roots, and focus a lot more on the anti-nuclear themes of that movie. And I do think the filmmakers did succeed in bringing Godzilla back to those darker roots. But the problem is that I think the filmmakers played it a little too safe in regards to its story. Because if I had to sum the story up, it's your standard monster run amok story in which you have a cast of human characters trying to figure out how to stop the monster. And honestly, that's about it. Sure, it might be refreshing to watch a solo Godzilla movie in which Godzilla's the only other giant monster, minus the giant sea lice that we see at the beginning of the movie, but other than that, I think the actual story could have been a lot better. I think it could have taken a little more risks. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, I think the pacing in the last half of the movie could have gone by a little faster, because I think the pacing for the first half of the movie moves at just the right speed where it's not moving too fast or too slow. It moves just right in regards to establishing the tone of the movie, introducing characters, and even slowly building up the return of Godzilla himself. But I feel once Godzilla begins his fight with the military in Tokyo Bay, that's where I think the movie slows down quite a bit for me, because there's certain scenes or shots that I feel didn't need to be there. And keep in mind, this movie is an hour and 40 minutes long. I feel that there's at least maybe a good 5 to 10 minutes that could have been cut out to increase the pace in the last half of the movie to make it go by a little faster. I have two examples in mind in regards to bits of editing scenes that didn't need to be there. One scene being the start of the battle between Godzilla and the Super X, because when we first see the Super X, we have a couple shots of it flying at the camera, and then we cut to a wide shot of Godzilla standing there doing nothing, and the camera begins to pan from left to right, and this continues for a few moments, and then we see the Super X flying not at Godzilla but at the camera because it's in the far background. And this never made any sense to me, because why keep that shot? Because the way it starts, you're under the impression Godzilla's looking at something, but he's not. I feel like if you're going to have this type of shot, it should have played out more something along the lines of this, where you see Godzilla kind of moving, then he stops, then the camera pans from left to right, and as it continues to pan, we see the Super X coming from the right side of the screen going towards the left side, charging at Godzilla. But we don't get that. Then, of course, you got the introduction of this homeless man that gets introduced in the last third of the movie and has really no bearing on the entire story, say, for one scene. But other than that, this character could have been removed altogether. He didn't need to be there. And I feel that his inclusion was nothing more than unnecessary comical relief. Another problem that I have with the movie revolves around Godzilla, because this movie is meant to be a sequel to the original 1954 movie. And at the end of that movie, Dr. Daisuke Serizawa sacrifices himself by using the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla in that movie. Now, fast forward to this movie, and this is where things don't add up, because as I just mentioned, Godzilla died in the original 1954 movie. Yet all of the characters within this movie are convinced the Godzilla that shows up in this movie is the same creature, which makes no sense. To put things in perspective, in other Godzilla movies that act as a sequel to the original 1954 movies, such as Godzilla Raids Again, or the first few installments of the Millennium era of the Godzilla franchise, there is a very clear-cut answer as to whether or not the Godzilla that's encountered in those movies is the same creature or a completely different specimen. With this movie, on the other hand, the characters treat this Godzilla as if it were the same specimen from the original 1954 movie, but in reality, it shouldn't be. So, for my final verdict of The Return of Godzilla, I consider this movie to be the Tim Burton Batman of Godzilla movies, in a sense where here's a movie whose goal was to bring the character back to their darker roots, since their previous installments were a bit more colorful and campy. And while I do think the movie succeeds at bringing Godzilla back to his darker roots, the movie, at the end of the day, is really nothing more than a standard creature run amok story that has some interesting politics, but I think they could have taken more risks with the story. And although this might not be my favorite Godzilla movie, I do recommend this one. So overall, The Return of Godzilla is a good but not great movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about The Return of Godzilla? Looks like the movie got really good reception. And so for my final rating of The Return of Godzilla, I give it a 3 out of 5. So, do you think this movie does a good job of celebrating Godzilla's at the time 30th anniversary? And see you later.